Depending on where in our wide world you're watching from, I bid you good morning, good afternoon, or perhaps good evening. Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. I'm David Young, Vice President for Applied Conflict Transformation at USIP. Thank you for joining us today for this forum on the Catholic Church and peacebuilding. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So said Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount, and so began the long peacebuilding career of the Catholic Church. In our times, that career has included diplomatic efforts at the highest levels, such as Pope John XXIII's critical role in defusing the Cuban Missile Crisis. It has also included the Church's support in the 1980s for the Solidarity movement in Poland and the original People Power movement in the Philippines. This duality, the actions of the Catholic Church to support top-down and bottom-up peacebuilding, explains our subtitle for today's discussion, Bridging the Gap Between People Power and Peace Processes. We would like to explore how the Catholic Church deftly juggles its roles of diplomat and mediator on the one hand, and the people's champion for social justice on the other. As a former altar boy and a continuing student of the Catholic Church, I would observe that while this duality might pose tactical challenges, it is nevertheless rooted in a holistic strategy of Catholic peacebuilding. In the contemporary history of the Church, this grand strategy of sorts dates from Pope John XXIII's Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, the April 1963 encyclical that Pope John issued shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis the previous October, and shortly before his death that June. In the encyclical, Pope John states that God created human beings with a conscience so that we can all understand the natural order of the universe. Indeed, peace on earth depends on our proper understanding of natural laws. In Pope John's view, natural law governs three sets of relationships in our lives. First, relations among our fellow humans. Second, relations among individuals in the state. And third, relations among states. First, in our relations with each other, Pope John echoes the natural law tradition of human rights. He writes that every human has, quote, the right to live, the right to bodily integrity, and to means necessary for the proper development of life, particularly food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, and finally, the necessary social services, unquote. He proceeds to explain other natural rights in the political, economic, social, and cultural spheres. This first section of the encyclical was in perfect harmony with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Pope John then turns to the relations between individuals and the state. He acknowledges that human society cannot thrive without the presence of those who, invested with legal authority, preserve its institutions and do all that is necessary to sponsor actively the interest of all its members. But Pope John also proceeds to say that governmental authority must also recognize natural law and the natural order of the universe. For him, that means the primary purpose of government is to ensure that the aforementioned natural rights must be recognized and protected. Finally, Pope John explains relations between states. These relationships, he writes, must also be in sync with natural law. Specifically, states must treat each other in accordance with the dictates of truth, justice, willing cooperation, and freedom. Further, he states, states should act with mutual trust, sincerity, and negotiation, and the faithful fulfillment of obligations assumed. In essence, although Pope John did not use these terms, his historic encyclical presented a vision of peace based on human rights, democratic institutions, and collective security. Pope John's successor, Paul VI, inspired by Pacem in Terris, established the Church's tradition of the World Peace Day on January 1st, 1968. Pope Francis used the occasion of the 50th World Day of Peace in 2017 to add an important coda to Pacem in Terris. Pope Francis entitled his message, "Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace." He observed that while the last century experienced 2 world wars, today, sadly, we find ourselves engaged in a horrifying world war fought piecemeal. By piecemeal, Pope Francis meant, quote, wars in many countries and continents, terrorism, organized crime, human trafficking, the abuses suffered by migrants, and the devastation of the environment. He said, violence is not the cure for our broken world. We must instead be true followers of Jesus by embracing his teaching of nonviolence. The Pope cited the examples of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King, and of Lima Bowie in Liberia. Pope Francis said, peacebuilding through active nonviolence is the natural and necessary complement to the Church's continuing effort to limit the use of force by the application of moral norms. And he noted that the best manual, as he put it, for the strategy of nonviolent peacebuilding was the 8 Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. Finally, he wrote, I pledge the assistance of the Church in every effort to build peace through active and creative nonviolence. So in my view, Pope John's 1963 Pacem in Terris plus Pope Francis's New Year message and coda together provide a holistic strategy of contemporary Catholic peacebuilding. USIP has long been interested in the leadership of the Catholic Church on peace. Our oldest thematic program focuses on the role of religious actors who are working for peace. It seeks to bring attention and support to religious peacebuilders who advocate with great courage for peace, nonviolence, human rights, and good governance. Our newest thematic programs at USIP focus on support to peace processes and nonviolent action, respectively. In this work, we are broadening participation in peace processes to expand the voices who are critical to shaping the contours of governance in society. Through our Nonviolent Action Program, we're providing support that recognizes how ordinary people can engage in collective action that builds power from the ground up to challenge injustice and to address the root causes of conflict. In particular, our research on the role of religious actors in formal peace processes is exploring the intersection of these 3 fields and aims to better understand how the inclusion or exclusion of religious leaders and communities in these complex peace processes can impact their outcome, both negatively and positively. In this research, we're unpacking some of the most common roles the Church has played, such as mediating disputes and channeling communication between conflicting parties, as well as serving as fierce advocates to bring peace and end suffering for those most affected by violence and conflict. And we at USIP want to build on the essential role that religious actors have played throughout history. Roles in engaging with nonviolent movements in support of peace with justice, from hosting nonviolent action trainings in church basements to offering safe harbor to activists fleeing repression. We applaud in particular the work of Pax Christi International, a project of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Since its founding in 2016, Pax Christi has worked to promote and develop nonviolent practices and strategies within the framework of a Catholic just peace. USIP is honored to be joined by a distinguished panel today, led by Reverend Robert McElroy, Bishop of the Diocese of San Diego. Bishop McElroy was born in San Francisco, indeed a 5th-generation San Franciscan. He was educated at Harvard, Stanford, and St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. He served as the parish priest throughout Northern California. He was later appointed to be Auxiliary Bishop of San Francisco in 2010. Pope Francis appointed him to be Bishop of San Diego in 2015. He also serves as the Vice President of the California Catholic Conference and as a member of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He's written two important books, The Search for an American Public Theology and the second, Morality and American Foreign Policy. He's widely recognized for his moral and ethical advocacy on a variety of issues, including the Church's support for peace and justice through nonviolence. Bishop McElroy will offer introductory remarks and then moderate our panel. I'd like to welcome, on behalf of all of my USIP colleagues, I'd like to welcome and thanks all of our panelists. Bishop McElroy, I thank you for your continuing leadership. Welcome, and as fellow San Franciscans of the same generation, I hope if you've become a San Diego Padres fan, as I've become a Washington Nationals fan, that we still have Willie Mays and the number 24 in our hearts. Welcome.
Yes, I am a Padres fan. When I came down here for the first dinner they had for me, the team gave me a Padres uniform with my name and on it, so I wear it once a year to the games. But San Francisco is still in my heart. So thank you very much, and I thank the Institute in particular for having the initiative to reflect upon these themes of peace building and nonviolence in the life of the Catholic community in its many dimensions. And I thank them for the Institute for bringing together all of us to understand better and to think how we can move forward in terms of the life of the Catholic community to make it a more productive actor in the international arena at all levels to build peace in our world. I would say that just as a basic structure, I think there are really four dimensions within the Catholic community that contribute to peace building and nonviolence. The first is at the international level in terms of the institutionalized role of the Catholic Church. You know, the Pope and the various participants in the central decision-making and action of the Church in the world. That the Catholic community is, 1 billion people throughout the world. It's also the oldest continuing functioning bureaucracy in the world. And it has relations with the great majority, official diplomatic relations with the great majority of nations in the world. And it's an oddity in that it has a unique identity in that set of diplomatic relations, because it is a nation state, a small nation state, the Vatican, but the diplomatic relations which the Vatican has with every nation are not governmental, not between an individual government and the Vatican. It's between an individual government and what's called the Holy See. In other words, it's the moral and spiritual dimension of the Catholic Church that has these diplomatic relations. It's not a country acting as a country. And I think that speaks to what the Catholic Church is understanding, that universal dimension and the role of the Pope and the group of individuals and leadership seek. They look on their identity in the international system in the formal sense as to build peace and to bring spiritual and moral reflection and opportunities to advance the principles of Pacem in Terris. So as an actor in the international system, the Catholic community is like an NGO in many ways, and yet it's a nation state. But it looks on its role in all of those elements as moral and spiritual. Now, at times, that role focuses on particular areas of interest to the Catholic communities around the world, for example, religious liberty issues in various countries. But I just want to emphasize that overall, the Church's own self-understanding of what its international role is in its institutional form is to help uplift, inform, a dialogue with the spiritual and moral dimensions of the human community to build solidarity and look for ways to advance human rights and to advance the cause of peace in crucial sectors. So much of what the diplomatic corps does in the Vatican, much of that is focused on specific ways when conflicts are developed or when there are opportunities for dialogue to advance peace building, to focus on that. The second dimension, beyond the church's kind of universal institutional intervention in the world and dialogue with the world in these questions, is within the particular national churches. Within each country, there are Catholic communities, again, that have an institutional form. And the churches in those nations often have critical roles in the society to try to build up solidarity, to try to, and in times of conflict, to be interveners, to try to mediate, to try to advance the cause of peace, to try to point out both injustices on the human rights level, but also injustices in terms of internal peace in countries. And thus, the Catholic community in each country often takes on a role within the nation itself, similar to that, the universal one that takes place at the Vatican. But within each country, there are often opportunities, and very dramatic opportunities, which the national churches have to advance the cause of peace. So that would be the second dimension. The third would be that there exists now, have always been, and a series of communities within the life of the Catholic Church around the world that have taken up this role of peace building in very profound and specific ways. So they are like laying seeds of peace building within the life of the church community and in the society as a whole. Marie Dennis is going to speak about Pax Christi. Pax Christi is one of those organizations. The San Egidio community, which exists in Rome, is one of those organizations which its whole culture and ethos is oriented toward peace building throughout the world. And thus it's been able to have effective mediating roles in various countries that have been very important, San Egidio. And yet San Egidio is just a group of people of faith who come together with a common aim and seek to realize it. But it gives them a status as independent actors to come in and be helpful in moments of great conflict or potential conflict. So, and then the final, the fourth dimension of the work of the church, beyond that of the universal church, the national Catholic communities, and then communities who have formed to advance the cause of peace as a moral and spiritual route. The fourth is, how does the Catholic Church as a community of faith speak to the issue of war and peace and violence within our world now? How does it help to form an ethos within the world as a whole in which peace building and conflict resolution are right at the center of public thinking at every level? And so that's where Pope Francis's recent statement is so important, because it signals the desire within the Catholic community to move from an ethic of war and peace, where the church is, the church helped develop the ethic of war and peace, but it was meant at its beginning to be a way of limiting war and peace in so many ways, all through its development in the medieval period, but now has become just a permission for countries to go to war. So how do we move from that to an ethic of issues of war and peace and conflict and peace, in which nonviolence is at the center and the heart of the discussion? So those four missions, I say, fall to the Catholic Church at this time and have been historically shaped, but at this moment, and I know our panelists are going to speak to how they have been worked out on the ground. So I would turn first to the question of asking the panel, how has in your area of experience, expertise, observation, and participation. How has the role of the church functioned and changed and been vibrant and made a difference? Professor Appleby, maybe you could go first.
Thank you, Bishop. I'll talk about 6 moments of evolution, if we will, over the since Pacem in Terris. I'll do it in 7 minutes. I think 6 highlights. We take many of these for granted now, but they are relatively new things since Pacem in Terris. The first I would mention is development is the new name for peace. Pope Paul VI mentioned this in 1967. That was his banner headline, if you will, in Populorum Progressio. But it's so important, and we've understood over the last 50 years or so that peace builders cannot work in settings effectively where poverty and hunger breed conflict. And development workers and development professionals also recognize the connection between stability, security, peace, cessation of shooting, and there are many dimensions to this. But we recognize that we can't isolate peacemaking, peace building from the work of development, and that those sets of professionals, activists, and church advocates need to work together. So development is the new name for peace. We'll say more about all these later, I imagine. Secondly, in my experience, when I first started, maybe 25 years ago, working in Catholic peace building, I came to it with the assumption that bishops and priests, being disciples, apostles of the Prince of Peace, were natural peace builders, and then, which was a dumb, naive assumption. Peace building is certainly rooted in our theological and religious and spiritual commitments to peace, but it's also a set of practices. And we had to recognize in the community that not all bishops were trained. When they were in seminary, when they were prepared, and priests as well, clergy and religious more generally, that it wasn't just like falling off a log, let's become peace builders. And so what we've seen evolve in a wonderful way over the last several decades is the clergy, women religious, and lay people all moving beyond an affirmation of the importance of peace, a kind of a spiritual orientation to peace, and adding expertise, if I can, ways to think about mediation and conflict resolution. And that ties to the third development over the last several decades. And that is when we think about peace, and when we ask our bishops and clergy and lay leaders to advocate peace, we are talking about something quite specific, capacious but specific, an arc. Sometimes we call it strategic peace building, different forms of peace building, elicitive peace building. But that means that we're active around the world, the church is, on an arc of peace building that begins with efforts at conflict prevention, at education, early warning of conflict. And the church, of course, is everywhere, and grassroots. And so that early warning, that prevention, that continuing attention to peacemaking is part of a larger comprehensive process that also leads to mediation and resolution. The bishops have been very involved in some parts of the world in actual mediation resolution. And then there's a whole phase of post-accord transitional justice and institution building. Now, there's a lot of literature on this, and most people, certainly everyone on this call and many in our audience, recognize it. I'm simply pointing to the fact that this has blossomed over the last 4 or 5 decades, and certainly the last 20 years, an awareness that this is an interrelated process and that we have to be present at all levels, from prevention to education to witness, early warning, mediation, resolution, and then the very hard work of implementing an agreement if it's signed. Then, in a way, you don't start all over, but you've got a whole new set of problems and challenges, and the church is present now around the world, here and there, at every phase of this comprehensive peace building notion, a process. That's the third. Fourth, women are recognized, and that I'd like to say more lavishly, that women are at the center of our awareness and of our activism. In fact, they are, but they've been hidden, as they have been in society and in the church. And over the last several decades, we've come to recognize how important women are to peace building, to this not one accord, not one moment, but a gradual process over many years. We can begin in a range here, so to speak, again, of women's involvement. It begins with the fact that in many of our conflicts that involve Catholics on both sides of the firing line, or former Catholics, it's a Catholic country, a country like Colombia, for example, or the Philippines. The women are the mothers, the sisters, the daughters of the combatants. They can often be incredibly effective just in their role as the glue to the family. Then you move across the spectrum to women who have been in leadership positions in advocating for nonviolence, in advocating for social justice. I won't go through the list of names, but they are profound, and there's more and more awareness of how central and how much attention we need to give to the special ministry and calling of women. There's been some, again, literature on this. I'll name check Susan Hayward and Catherine Marshall. There are others who have written about women and peace building. It's a growing literature, and we need more attention to it. But it's relatively new, like many of the things I'm mentioning, relatively new over the last number of years. The important role of women. Fifth, and that is the growing trajectory we'll talk more about of nonviolence. And we're going to say a lot about that. But there are internal differences within the church that we know about nonviolence, about the importance of nonviolent witness, and that peace building has to be nonviolent, full stop. We have an internal dialogue within the Catholic Church on so many issues, one of which is just war versus nonviolence and as approaches. But this consistent witness of the popes has been on the side of nonviolence, not only Pope Francis, who's been a terrific champion, but Pope John Paul II was an early advocate right when he began his papacy. He went to Ireland and gave an impassioned speech saying, nonviolence is the only way to build peace. We'll say more about that later. It's led to tensions within the church because Catholics are actors within conflicts on all sides. And I can say more later about how difficult it is for these actors who are in shooting wars to actually practice nonviolence or to even acknowledge it as a church teaching, oddly, when it's been a consistent witness not only of the popes, but of the church from top to bottom for the last decades. Finally, one of the things we're more aware of now over the last number of years is the challenges there are to actual peace building from the church itself, among the church itself. I'll say my little anecdote, and then my time is up. I was having a beer with a newly ordained priest in Burundi several years ago. And he has just been ordained, and this was after a period of intense violence in the region. And we were talking about his ethnic ties or ethnicity in that context. What goes deeper in a person? Is it ethnicity? Is it tribe? Is it region? Is it people? Or is it the broader teaching of the gospel? This is a newly ordained priest, and he was struggling with this. I said, if your family was threatened and you needed to, you thought, do violence to support your people, but your priesthood and your apostolic calling said, no, nonviolence is the way, what would you do? Very sensitively, he said, I would defend my family by whatever means. And I think that's a microcosm of the struggles of ethnicity, clan, loyalty, family in conflict settings, but a calling to this work of real apostolic virtue of actual nonviolence. It's difficult. It's a challenge. We'll say more about that. So 6 lessons or 6 moments of evolution since Pacem in Terris. Sorry that went quick and too long, but there it is.
Thank you, Scott. Sergio, could you just focus for us in the concrete for experience, particularly in Nicaragua? What are the on-the-ground roles that the church has in advancing or being unable to advance peace building and nonviolence?
Well, before answering that question, I think that it is important to mention that in Nicaragua, the Catholic Church happens in other countries in Latin America has a very strong tradition of involvement in politics, and not any politics. It's a very turbulent politics since Nicaragua is by itself has an inclination for contentious politics. We have had revolutions, civil wars, and different kind of expressions that are above the institutional level of the politics by itself. But in all these episodes or events of violent conflicts or very conflictual situations, the Catholic Church has displayed two important roles. The first one, as Professor Appleby was saying, is like it was working as an early system, an early warning system, trying to identify some indicators that possible conflicts will emerge. This kind of diagnosis of problems is very important, and we have seen this in all the decades before, but mainly in the most recent conflict in Nicaragua, the 2018 wave of protests. I'm going to explain this later. But the church has been able to identify signs of deterioration in the institutionality in the country, in the politics, some expression of detriment of values in the country that tend to create conflicts at the local level and also at the national level. So that kind of diagnosis of problems is the first role that we can identify in all these conflicts and turbulent history in Nicaragua. And the second dimension or the second role is a prognostic role. The church is always using this kind of prognostic frames for the specific conflicts that the country is facing. And they have been very clear that they, for instance, as bishops, I am talking at the bishops level with the Nicaraguan Bishops Conference, they have been very clear that they do not offer technical solutions for the conflicts that Nicaragua is always undergoing. They are offering like moral guidance, and also they are putting all the church infrastructure, human resources to help to solve the conflicts. But the church, they are very clear in this, they do not have technical solutions for the many problems that are always related to the political conflicts in this. But this happening, of course, at the bishop's level, as I was saying, but we can identify this role of prognosis, this role of putting the church infrastructure in order for the peace building and the mediation of conflicts, also at the local and regional level. So those two roles we can see that happening in all the conflicts in Nicaragua. This happened with the Sandinista revolution in 1979. The church early alerted signs of deteriorations for human rights under the Somoza dictatorship, and also supported the Sandinistas that year with the uprising in the climax of the revolution in 1979. And then, of course, the church alerted about the signs of the new authoritarianism with the Sandinistas in 1980s, and of course denounced the alignment of the Marxist ideology with the new government in that year, and that sign of human rights violations also. And then for the democratic restoration in the 1990s, the church also was trying to influence the politics, the internal politics in the country, also in this role of prognostic, proposing some ways to influence and to have this kind of influence in the national politics. And with the return of President Ortega in 2007, the church at the very beginning, of course, was pointing so many strengths in the government, good policies related to education, related to the economy, the institutions, for instance, but also it was pointing since the very beginning signs of deterioration in the institutionality, and was alerting to the country and even for the opposition that possible conflicts were going to emerge since the very beginning of the return of President Ortega. And with its consolidation of authoritarianism in all these years, in 2018, a wave of protests erupted in the country that left more than 300 casualties and a lot of repressions. So the church was early alerting that this conflict was going to emerge, and when it happened, the church got involved, participated with the protesters, and also was ready when even the government asked the church to mediate that particular conflict. And this had a lot of challenge that I am sure that we will have the opportunity to talk a little bit later. But these two frames, these two roles, diagnosis and prognosis of the conflicts and possible solutions are always there in the politics in the country. And I'm sure that it is also the case for other countries in Latin America.
Great, thank you so much, Sergio. And from diagnosis and prognosis to the question of moving minds and hearts, I would ask Marie Dennis from Pax Christi to speak to the role of peace building within Catholic communities and launched by Catholic communities in the larger society to address that. You need to take your mute off, Marie.
Thank you, Bishop McElroy. Yes, the conversation is a very large one. The Catholic Church plays so many different roles that are very important in the task of building peace. I think what I'd like to emphasize particularly is that in addition to more formal roles, the Church can play a very, very important role in preparing the ground for peace, preparing Catholic people to both begin to build or continue to build cultures of peace, and also to understand the role of nonviolence as a very deep belief in the Catholic tradition. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that I am part of is a part of Pax Christi International. It exists to encourage the Catholic Church to move active nonviolence to the center of Catholic life and teaching. We're talking about nonviolence as a very deep and wide practice. It's a spirituality, it's a way of life, it's a global ethic, it's an effective and powerful tool for interrupting or preventing violence, for protecting vulnerable people, and so on. We think of nonviolence as different from pacifism, and in many ways as that middle road between the use of violence and passivity or doing nothing. So what we have seen in the last short while is the very important role that the institutional church is able to play in building a groundswell, if you will, and deepening the tools that Catholic people around the world have to apply nonviolence in sometimes very difficult situations, but also to live nonviolently. It's a very broad concept, and we think that what the Church has been doing and can do is almost the work of tilling the soil to build a more peaceful world. What we ask, what if 1.3 billion Catholics around the world had a full understanding of the power and effectiveness of active nonviolence and the connection of nonviolence to the heart of the gospel? We think that could make a tremendous difference. And where the Church has assumed that role as a formator, a teacher, it has been very effective. The classic example, of course, is the Philippines. During the revolution, or as the revolution was approaching to oust the dictator Marcos, the Catholic Church played a very important role in encouraging the education about how to use nonviolence in the form of civil resistance. It's one example, but I think a very effective one. After a significant period of training members of the Church at every level, the Catholic community in the Philippines was able to make a significant contribution to sustaining a nonviolent presence, even in a very difficult situation. We know that the Catholic Church has a very well-developed network of universities, seminaries, religious communities, local parishes, publications and media outlets. As you said, Bishop McElroy, the Church has a diplomatic presence in almost every country and at all of the major international organizations, as well as a rich theological and spiritual resource that could make a really tremendous contribution to the development and acceptance of nonviolent approaches to a more peaceful world. I think in the last, 50 years or so, as the church has seen practical examples of nonviolence in action and seen the possibility of nonviolence actually being an effective tool even in challenging governance situations where good governance is very needed. The church has more and more sort of moved in the direction of how do we not only prevent war, stop violence, but how do we also build a more peaceful world? And we believe that the contribution that the church has already made, as was described, not only in recent times, but since Pacem in Terris, to building an understanding of a nonviolent way of life, is very significant. And we hope that that will continue.
Thank you, Marie. In so many ways, what you've all been talking about is a process of conversion at various levels. How do we convert local communities to understand the capacity they have to be builders of peace? How do we help convert national communities which are in conflict to understand the pathways that are available to them, even in periods of tremendous conflict and historic conflict, and then within the international arena? Pope Francis's statement on the World Day of Peace really is a new stage of what has been an ongoing trajectory in the life of the Catholic community at the international level, and that is wrestling with the questions of nonviolence and peace. And the Institute itself of Peace, and Maria Stephan, her research has been particularly helpful in showing the ability of nonviolent means to be powerful propellants toward peaceful resolution of even searingly difficult conflicts. Mm-hmm. But given all of that, what opportunities do you see for the Catholic Church at various levels to be builders of this conversion, or promoters of this conversion? You know, conversion is at the heart of what Catholicism is. How can we be converting people, communities, nations to peace building in this robust sense? Because one of the difficulty, our history comes with us, and our history has been rooted in recent times in the just war tradition, which is not centered on nonviolence. It is an effort to avoid war, but it's been defanged in so many ways in terms of its limitations in recent years. I think back to Pax Christi, which Marie was speaking about, the work of Pax Christi. Pax Christi means the peace of Christ. Pax Christi was in the medieval period, wasn't it? And it was a way of building peace even within conflicts in the traditional way. But how can we, so for any of you, Scott or Sergio or Marie, any of you have a thought on how the church can move forward in being an agent of conversion toward nonviolence, institutionalized nonviolence, nonviolence of the heart, not strategic nonviolence within the situations in the world?
Well, I'd like to pick up on that with a few suggestions. I think that the moment in which we are now, that we're living through right now, with the pandemic, with the tremendous challenges that are presented by that reality, what we are seeing is that many different expressions of violence have been made visible, both direct violence, but also structural violence, the violence of poverty, the violence of environmental destruction, and so on. Right now, the church, thanks to the leadership of Pope Francis, has focused enormous energy on articulating, describing what kind of a future we can move toward after this pandemic. And with a lot of focus on the 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, we believe that an essential component of the building of a new normal, if you will, with the vision of Laudato Si, of a world where of a reality where humans and the rest of creation live in right relationship. What we believe is that nonviolence has to be a part of that move into a new normal. First, because it describes the kind of conversion. Pope Francis talks about an ecological conversion. An ecological conversion has to be a conversion to nonviolence, because nonviolence has to describe our relationship with the natural world as well as with each other. Besides that, I think that the kinds of changes that are going to be needed in a post-pandemic period of time are tremendous, deep, systemic transformations that will probably only be possible if there is a well-prepared, well-supported, clear, nonviolent social movement to make that happen. We as people have to be ready to accept significant changes, and I think that they are precisely the kinds of changes that nonviolent movements are best equipped to accomplish. So, deep education, preparation, formation, investment in sorting out what are the most effective nonviolent strategies to use in what situations, and which the kind of research that Maria and her colleague Erica Chenoweth did. How do we know what to do when? And then I think that the other piece that I think the church can do that is extremely important right now is to listen to the experience of local people living in contexts of violence, of war, yes, but of all kinds of violence. The Synod on the Amazon was a very interesting, important example of that. But I think it's also important because it is local communities living in specific contexts that understand best what nonviolent action will look like in their context and when nonviolence can be particularly effective. So I think that those are the directions in which the Catholic Church right now at a global level is very well positioned to lead the world.
Thank you, Marie. I was a delegate to the Amazon Synod, and it was interesting to me that at the beginning, every day, there was at the front of the room the pictures and photos of from the Amazon region, the martyrs to nonviolence. Mm-hmm. More than 100 of them that were there as a constant reminder to us of both the cost of promoting nonviolence and conversion and the opportunities there and the necessity for it. So Sergio or Scott, do you want to say anything?
I would like to add something about what we were discussing right now, is that there is also another thing that we have to consider in how the church can contribute to the peace processes. And I think that this is related to what you were saying, Bishop, is which level of the Catholic Church we have to activate in some conflicts. Because we cannot see all the levels activated in some particular conflicts or violent situations. And the Nicaraguan case is very illustrative in this regard. For instance, we saw the Catholic level, the community level, the grassroots level of the church being very involved with the protesters, defending the human rights and the people on the streets, on the context of a lot of repression. And that's a matter of coherence, right? With the gospel, with the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. But on the other side, we had at the bishops' level, we have the bishops organizing a dialogue, a process of negotiation, and that happened, and then they were also supporting the protesters in a different manner. And on the other side, we had on the upper level, you said the diplomatic level, the Papal Nuncio, and all the structure of the transnational church behind, and that these kind of three dimensions that were all of them in the conflict, like trying to have the different roles in the conflict in Nicaragua in 2018. And I think that when we see, or at least the church presents itself as a unique body and a unique dimension in this regard, I think that might be a kind of problematic in some conflicts. And the church and also have to present itself with three different dimensions and being very clear which one is being participated in some process of negotiations. And when we don't see this line or the limits are very blurred, that can be very problematic in some cases.
And I would add, just to build on what both Marie and Sergio said, on Marie's point, I think what we're recognizing is that nonviolence is a way toward conversion more generally. Catholics are always in need of metanoia, of turning around, of rethinking their relationship to the world. And nonviolence is such a radical idea at first blush, but so also is the gospel. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy. This is a way more broadly, certainly for peace building, but more broadly to revitalize and renew the Catholic community locally, nationally, worldwide, to have the Catholic community struggle with, in the best sense of that term, what it means to live a life that is radically one of service and eschews all forms of violence. That in itself is a conversion moment for the church. So I just want to amplify all the great things Marie was saying. On Sergio's point, I take it in a direction too. There are folks, many good, in fact, many peace builders, at least at a time, who weren't familiar with the Catholic Church. And from outside, you look at the Catholic Church and you might think, boy, it has its act together. It's hierarchical. It's got a pope. It's got the bishops. It's got all these people working around the world. And when we draw those folks into peace building conversations, we don't tell them, hey, the little secret is we don't agree on every level and we're always fighting with one another. So that's part of any human community, including the church from the time of the apostles. But the point I want to make is that, as Sergio was saying, you need all levels, and Marie talked about the social movement, which is really a revolution in the church, nonviolence and peace building at the center. So my hope would be that because more and more bishops and priests, here I'm going to talk about that thin slice of the church, so to speak, numerically, but how important it is that the people on the ground, the social movements, the people who are implementing, the people who are working for the church, recognize that their activities are being blessed by the church in its institutional sense. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have wonderful bishops who do that. And over these last number of years, we have more and more bishops and priests in particular who have had direct experience in peace building around the world. So it's not as if this is not a movement within the church that is unknown. There are more and more advocates, but not everyone's converted in the hierarchy. Not everyone's converted in the clergy. And so my hope would be that the bishops, Pope Francis's leadership, but not only the Pope, not only the bishops, not only the clergy, but there's nonetheless an institutional momentum that links the importance of peace building and nonviolence to overall conversion, which bishops are always calling us to renewal and conversion. If that link can be made, and so you take it a little bit, displace it a little bit from this or that just war debate and talk about it as a way of life, the way of the gospel, boy, it would be great to have more and more of the hierarchy in particular singing from the same hymn book. And more are, but there are parts of the world where there are people who are in the church who are not helpful, frankly. And we need to do better there.
Thanks. We're now come to the time in which we're moving to questions from those who are participating from afar. And so I would just remind you, you could submit questions to the event page on the U.S. Institute of Peace website, and we've received some. So one goes to where you left off, Scott. What keeps Pope Francis from issuing an encyclical on nonviolence? Now, I have to say, if I hadn't been watching Marie on the screen this whole time and know she couldn't type anything without my seeing it, I would have thought she submitted that, because that has been a very significant issue, a significant initiative from Pax Christi to try to get an encyclical from Pope Francis on the question of nonviolence. And so there are complications in an encyclical, and she and I have discussed many times, they're different. Whether an encyclical is the right instrument for it, I'm not sure. But I think where we are both agreed is that it is important to shift in the teaching of the Catholic Church and in the articulated doctrinal tradition of the Church as it has emerged in the present day, that peacemaking, nonviolence, is the primary way for the Church avenue for in Catholic teaching to approach issues of conflict resolution, not a secondary. I think the way it is now is that just war theory is the primary way, and I think I would certainly agree that, and I think this is where Pope Francis is moving, is that the primary avenue in Catholic thinking for conflict resolution, even complex international conflict resolution, is that of the pathway of nonviolence. And as I say, the just war theory has a fine tradition that was originally meant to limit war, but that is just the guts of it have been torn out, frankly. And so it's used by countries to justify going to war and groups to justify conflict, rather than acting as a constraint on conflict, which was its original intention. So does anybody else have any question on this encyclical question? Any comment?
Well, maybe just a word or two, since we have been asking for an encyclical for a number of years, but recognizing that have come to recognize that although we hope someday there will be an encyclical on nonviolence and just peace, that there are other ways that the Church can teach and signal a move in that direction, even other ways of expressing a magisterial document. The World Day of Peace message was very important. We're hoping that perhaps there could be a year of nonviolence, or a commitment to nonviolence within the dicastery in terms of staff, partly because one of the challenges, I think, is that, yes, we want the Church to make a statement about nonviolence, but maybe even more important is encouraging a deeper dive into an understanding of nonviolence, of seeing nonviolence as a spectrum of possibilities, from diplomacy to trauma healing to restorative justice and civil resistance and so on. And I think that the World Day of Peace message really began to do that. I think there have been other ways in which Pope Francis has been doing it. We hope someday it will be gathered together in one major document. But in the meantime, a lot is happening.
Sergio?
Maybe in this regard, I just want to highlight the power of these words that not necessarily are in the encyclicals, but also in the speeches of different the popes or the bishops. In the 2018 wave of protests in Nicaragua, it was common to see the priests and religious nuns always framing their participation in protests, and they're supposed to protest by the words of Pope Francis or different encyclicals or different phrases that he always used in his speeches. For example, in Spanish, los jóvenes hagan lío, youth participate in politics and that kind of stuff. And that constant frame of the social teaching of the Church and the more recent influence of Pope Francis in this involvement in social life, and also the peace building perspective involvement in this kind of conflicts, it is very important. And the power of words is really relevant at the concrete and very micro level.
Thank you, Sergio. The next question is, Professor Appleby spoke about the importance of women's involvement in Catholic peace building. Could the panelists share more concretely what an inclusive approach to Catholic peacebuilding looks like, including engagement of youth and women. Okay. Scott, do you want to?
Yes, I will. I'll simply refer to some of my own experience watching and admiring women in Mindanao, in the Philippines. Friends of mine, colleagues who have worked with the church and with Catholic Relief Services, bringing the church and Catholic Relief Services into even closer alliance. And my experience talking about Myla Laguro, many people know Myla, but her colleagues there, Ding, others who work in Mindanao in very difficult situations in this long-standing conflict. And their agency has been, I put it this way, without them, nothing happens. Because not only are they the people who bring the bishops and the priests and the laity together in terms of mapping the area, knowing the church, knowing the social network. So they're the people who are the coordinators, but also they themselves are exemplars of patience, endurance, courage in the face of violence, fortitude. They're actually embodiments of this ethic of nonviolence and an ethic of peace. And so what I've observed is that the dilemma, I think, in a way, is that they are servants. And yet I've also seen them subordinated. And you know, I wanted at one point to say, let's all these guys shut up, and would you please? Now that would embarrass them, but their insight into the community, into the dynamics, into the grassroots is so concrete that they're the ones who really, in a way, should be leading the discussion. But they're not always welcomed in that role, and partly is because their spirit is one of service, but also because they're marginalized, that people don't recognize that often that the depth of wisdom that comes from their embeddedness in the local community, again, in various roles, as mediators, as members of families, as those with real connections to the suffering, they are the pulse of the community. So anyway, there are, the more that we can empower these women who are in that embedded situation, local communities, to have a real voice in how we think about peace and how we come to understand and recognize the real challenges that the community has in living nonviolence, even as one strategy. The more we see it from their eyes, I think we'll be just wiser and more effective and more of a church.
Thank you. The next question is, as many countries are entering the election season, is there a role for the Catholic Church in preparing Catholics to assist in the peaceful transitions during or following elections?
We will have an electoral.
Go ahead, Sergio.
And the position of the church in this electoral process will be crucial, especially in how the church prepare the citizenry for their participation. At least since 2011, the church hasn't called the people to participate in an electoral process because of many indicators of fraudulent maneuvers, political maneuvers in the electoral process. And if the church, for instance, has a voice and said, it is time to vote, it is time to participate and to have this electoral weight out of the current crisis in Nicaragua, it will be very determinant. Again, this is part of the early system, early warning system that the church always has. So the church will kind of frame that if the electoral process is acceptable, the electoral process will be something that the people can actually put their voices on the process. And I think that will be crucial, at least for the case of Nicaragua in particular. The church is always an institution that is determinant in the elections.
Let me just add one quick comment on that also, Bishop. In Colombia, this is not about elections directly, but in Colombia, as you know, the country is going through a process of implementing these comprehensive peace accords that were signed 4 or 5 years ago. It's a very complicated process that's fraught with tension. FARC, the government, various rebel groups. It's very hard to keep it afloat. The one institution, I think, or one of the central institutions in Colombia is the Catholic Church and the Social Pastoral led by Monsignor Hector Fabio Hanau. He's also in a position to convene all the parties through the National Peace, Reconciliation, and Coexistence Council. It's absolutely invaluable what role, and absolutely essential, the role that the Caritas and Monsignor and his team are playing, because they have the trust and the confidence of all the players, and that is so rare. And there are situations around the world in which the Catholic Church is at its best, able to convene, to mediate, to lead a process as complicated as implementing these dozens, hundreds of provisions in a peace accord, and to do so in a way that somehow keeps these warring parties talking. And there is a commonality in Catholicism in Colombia. There is a common platform. It's complicated, but the church is so central to these kinds of processes. And we have been telling these stories, but there are many stories around the world of this kind of mediation and convening power of the church for peace.
I would say, as an American bishop, the ethic within our bishops' conference is to support the local churches in any given country, their approach to these issues, and to support them. But there are questions like in Venezuela, for example, we find it difficult to tangibly support in the ways that are important to them because of the restrictions. So, but there, just as a way of understanding more how the Catholic community functions, bishops' conferences in other countries defer to the situation on the ground and try to be of assistance in that. The other thing I just note, which maybe I shouldn't say, but I never thought we'd be in our country in a moment when this question would be of relevance to us. What will we do as Catholic bishops of the United States if there is a problem in our current election in terms of the outcome if it is heavily disputed? But that will be a responsibility we may be facing here too. The next question, as Marie mentioned, COVID is exacerbating the root causes of conflict around the world. What can the church do to help mitigate the impact of COVID and its relation to conflict?
Well, I can say just a few words about that. I'm sure others can as well. I think that what the church at global level has been doing has been a very interesting effort to listen to local communities and to begin with, and to understand how the pandemic is affecting, for example, indigenous communities in the Altiplano of Peru, or refugees living in camps in Syria or Greece, and on and on. And then to both put the resources of the church through Caritas, through church communications channels, through the diplomatic corps and so on, at the service of doing everything possible to avert both the extreme suffering of the poorest communities in the world, which is what's happening now, and then the to make sure that the whatever assistance, whatever ways that the church is present and can help, is always done in such a way that it is conflict conscious, so that it's aware of the potential for exacerbating tensions in a particular community. But I think listening to local communities, engaging local communities, which the church at a global level and at a local level is doing. And then I think this task of not, Pope Francis said, don't prepare for the future, prepare the future, which I think is exactly what the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission is about trying to do. It's complicated, it's huge, but we need to have articulated a vision for the future beyond this crisis. And I think the church can be very helpful in getting that conversation going and supporting it.
Just ask one final question. What can the church in the United States do at various levels to assist peace building and nonviolence on all the levels we've been talking about internationally?
I think that one of the biggest challenges in the mediation role of the church is that most of these processes doesn't have a binding effect. Like the church is there, is mediating, but there is no implication of what are the results besides just the will and the word of the participants. I think that when the church activates its transnational dimensions and work with other, let me say this, powerful churches in terms of politics, like the Bishops' Conference in the United States, it can activate a kind of binding effect, political implications to all these processes. So this by creating these connections at the political level with centers of power, of political power in the world, I think that that's important to validate some of these kind of processes that happen at the local or micro level, or even at the national level, but in small countries. I think that connection between small countries conferences and big countries conferences is very important. And the United States Bishops' Conference could have a very important role in this kind of situation.
I would have a related comment on that, Bishop, if I could, and you very courageously opened the door for it. And that's this. You know, the world watches the United States, and it also watches the church in the United States. And I would hope that the church in the United States is more outspoken and direct and powerful about the trends in our society. And I'll say under this administration, or this presidential administration, in which hatred and division and the suggestions of violence are absolutely antithetical to both the country's values and the church's values. And I'd like to see more, and I think the world would benefit from our bishops speaking out and speaking out boldly and not worrying about the political consequences, because maybe I shouldn't put it that way, not worrying about, I don't want to be glib, but around the world, that's what bishops have to do and are called to do. They're in much worse situations in many cases, of course, than the United States. Let's make that clear. But they have to speak out at great risk to themselves. They're, as you know, real martyrs around the church, not only among the laity and the clergy, but among the hierarchy. So anyway, that's what I would hope, that the Catholic Church in this country is more and more an outspoken prophet. When the church sees, as I think we all do, trends in our society that are absolutely unacceptable and against the values of both the nation and the church.
Thanks, Scott Marie.
I would just add to that in addition, I would hope that the church in the United States, the whole church, would see implemented in Catholic universities, in seminaries, in local churches, parishes, a deep, wide, creative educational process around nonviolence and the skill, building the skills of how to live the gospel in our times in this country.
Great, thank you, Marie. And I'm going to toss it over to someone who's been doing that for so many years, Maria, to close us.
Well, thank you, Bishop McElroy. And this has been just such an incredibly rich conversation. I just first want to thank our panelists, Scott, Marie, Sergio. Thank you so much, Bishop McElroy, for being such a great moderator. Thanks to David for his very meaningful opening remarks, and special thanks to our Religion and Inclusive Societies team for really taking the lead in organizing today's event. I guess a couple of key messages. We only have about a minute left, so a couple of key messages that really stick with me from this conversation is really how the church can be an agent of conversion, really because of its unique role at the international level, its diplomatic means at the national level, and especially at the community levels. And Scott mentioned that nonviolence is the means of conversion. And I think, Pope Francis's 2017 World Day of Peace message on nonviolence as a style of politics for peace was so profoundly important in kind of laying out the importance of centering nonviolence and just peace at the core of the church's activities. And I think there's such great potential, as Marie and others, and Sergio, you talked about the role of the church at all different levels as a mediator, as someone who helped to facilitate a national dialogue in Nicaragua as the protests broke out, while at the same time serving as a witness and supporting the grassroots and serving as a witness to human rights violations. So I think there's such great opportunity for centering the message of active nonviolence and really deepening the investment and commitment at all levels, from the diplomatic level, in training, in education, and nonviolence, conflict resolution, civil resistance, unarmed civilian protection. The range of tools available to serve as alternatives to violence are vast, and they have proven to be very effective, including in places where you would think they would not be effective. So I think if, we can continue the conversation about what that might mean practically to center active nonviolence at the heart of the church, and what that might mean here in the United States and also globally, I think that would be just a wonderful continuation of the amazing work that you all are doing. So again, I want to thank you all for participating, and I want to thank our audience around the world from tuning in. And with that, I would just really wish everyone a wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you very much.